All right. Well, first off, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today. I greatly appreciate it, and I also appreciate the kind introduction. Obviously, the largest distinction was being the office mate of some of the panelists today. So it's nice to see your faces. Today, what I'd like to talk about is the founding of Laser Associated Sciences. Talk about some of the journey that we had from the very beginning and how we worked on the technology for measuring blood flow, how that matured over time, and finally how that got to acquisition. And so sort of rolled up in all that story is what the purpose of LAS was. And so what I'd like to kick this off with is a description of the problem on which this entire journey is predicated. So I'd like to start with just a bit of background about what LAS set out to do. And that was to treat peripheral artery disease, or PAD. And PAD is one of those diseases where you probably know it, even if you don't know it exactly by the name. So it's a disease state in which blockages form in the arteries, typically in the legs, and cause a reduction in adequate blood flow to the limbs. And in the US alone, the number of people afflicted is somewhere between 8 to 12 million, upwards of 20 million if you count undiagnosed individuals. And despite its prevalence, the mortality is also quite high. If you look at those diagnosed, the 5-year mortality rate is 30%, which is pretty striking. So it's probably not very surprising that we expend a lot of resources in the treatment of PAD, which usually comes in the form of stents and balloons, which are used for angioplasty, upwards of about 2 billion plus every single year. And despite all these efforts, the human cost, the financial cost, PAD is still the leading cause of lower limb amputation and costs our healthcare system north of $10 billion every single year. And so, when you look at this scenario, it becomes pretty clear quickly that there's a clear need in the space for technology that can help in improving surgical efficacy to treat PAD, as well as to try and monitor the disease and diagnose the disease more effectively. And we were really focused on that surgical component at first, and fundamentally asked ourselves the question of what's driving the poor outcomes for patients with PAD. Again, 5-year mortality rate of around 30%. So to kind of understand where the problem lies, you have to look at the modern cath lab, which is where these angioplasty treatments are generally taking place. And there's a picture of one here on the left. And there's a lot of equipment there with a capital cost upwards of $1 million plus. But all of it's really dedicated to a singular purpose, and that is imaging, particularly X-ray imaging or angiography. And what all that system allows a doctor to do when they're treating PAD is to look for the location and the degree of blockage, what we call stenosis, in the arteries for the afflicted limb. And so you may look at an X-ray image like the one I have on the screen and think that a doctor can go in, find where the blockage is located, and treat it with a balloon or with a stent, and that should elicit a positive outcome for that patient. But in reality, PAD is a progressive disease, and when a patient comes in, we're not talking about a singular stenosis. We're talking about multiple stenoses in multiple locations of varying severity. And a clinician has to go in and they need to make a judgment call based on their experience as to where they can treat, what they should treat, and to what degree. Because they can't go in and treat everything. That's not in the best interest of the patient or the hospital, and it's not economically viable. So there's a great degree of judgment that comes in to treating these patients effectively. And then that's coupled with the fact that by looking at X-rays alone, you're not actually measuring the thing that you're ultimately interested in. PAD is a restriction in adequate blood flow. And even if you can treat where these blockages are in the arteries, it doesn't tell a clinician that blood flow has actually been restored by doing that. So what that means is that there's nothing in that cath lab which can tell a clinician that what they did is actually having the end goal which they want, which is restoring blood flow. So just to give you an example of that, this is an angiography, an X-ray image of a patient where you can see the before on the left and the after on the right. And you don't need to know about angiography to see that there's a more prominent blood vessel in the after. But you can see that when you look at this, is that an adequate restoration of contrast to heal a wound, to have a positive outcome? A clinician can't look at this and just know. This is based upon their own subjective interpretation, and it, for that reason, elicits variable results, and some of them end up being negative and not in the best interest for the patient. So we were aimed at trying to address this problem, and ultimately, when you fast forward to the solution, the way that we got at that was the development of a technology that we call FlowMet. And so this is a technology that looks similar to a pulse oximeter for anyone that's familiar with that. Essentially, it's a clip which is placed onto the digit, and it uses an optical technology or light-based technology to measure blood flow in real time in the digit. And then it reports that value back to a clinician so they're able to look at the screen and directly measure how much blood flow is being restored during a surgery to tell them that what they're doing is working. So fundamentally, what does FlowMet do? It answers really two simple and critical questions. Is what I'm doing working? And tangentially, if it's working, to what degree is it actually working? And then fundamentally, when am I done? So have I restored enough blood flow through the course of this treatment so that I can be confident that my patient's going to have a positive outcome? And so these are really simple, rudimentary questions, but nonetheless, these are difficult questions to answer if you don't have a tool like this. And the way that we tried to convey this to our end users was having a user interface that looks like this. The details are unimportant, but we measured a flow value. We gave it to a clinician quantitatively. We did it in real time. We gave them detailed information about the dynamics of that blood flow, and we allowed them to track it through the entire course of the treatment so they could compare the before, the middle, and the after. But all of this is obviously towards the end of the journey, and it doesn't kind of tell you what's in the middle, because LAS was founded in 2012, and ultimately we were acquired in 2020, in March of 2020. And so what I wanted to focus on was essentially all of the in-between, so all of the things that went right, wrong, or somewhere in the middle during the course of trying to get to the point where I was just describing. And so that kind of starts in the very beginning with the three co-founders of LAS. So myself and two other more intelligent individuals, Tyler Rice and Bruce Yang. All three of us came out of the Beckman Laser Institute, which is part of UCI. And the reason we even became aware of the problem to begin with is because Beckman Laser Institute, or BLI, is this great mix of both technology development and a clinic, and it allows you to interact with practicing clinicians or doctors. And it was through interacting with some of those doctors that we became aware of this problem of having this need to measure flow, particularly for patients with PAD. And myself, Bruce, and Tyler, we all worked on various embodiments of a technology for looking at blood flow in the tissue. And so it's not too far a stretch to see that we had some background in measuring blood flow. There seemed to be a need. And so we were looking to potentially marry what we were working on as part of our graduate studies to help find a solution to this problem. And just by way of background, there's going to be some members of the audience here that's going to look very familiar to. But we worked on a technology called laser speckle imaging, and this is a technology wherein you can use laser light to actually measure how much blood flow there is in tissue. So a clinical system is shown on the left there, and it creates images like the one you see on the right, where you can actually map how much tissue there is in a various portion of the tissue. And so you may be asking yourself, why did no one put these two things together earlier? Because the laser spectral imaging has been around for about 30 years. So if there's this clear need, why hasn't this type of technology found its way into use, especially in the clinical sphere? And fundamentally, there's various reasons for this, but some of the technical challenges are many of the systems are large and complex. They don't lend themselves to simple clinical use. They can also be expensive. They can counterintuitively give too much information, and that if I take you back to this image here of the hand, a clinician might just want to know what's the blood flow in the hand. And so being able to look at this image and say, well, it varies depending on where you're looking and which tissue compartment. Sometimes more is not necessarily better. And being able to give a simple, informative, and quantitative metric is a bit of trying to simplify the delivery of the information. And laser spectral imaging certainly falls into that category. And furthermore, the technology tends to have shallow measurements, generally speaking, which means you're really only looking at skin blood flow, and the measurements tend to be relative, meaning that I can't take a measurement from me and compare it to somebody else. And so if you ever want to use this type of technology for diagnostics or making an actual clinical interpretation from the value that you measure, it can be very challenging. And so these were all the technical challenges that we were up against in trying to take this thing that we worked on and try and find a niche for it in the clinical space. And I've already sort of cheated and showed you where we landed, but ultimately our goal was to create a unique imaging system, laser system, form factor that kind of checked all of these boxes. And so on the right is sort of the idea of where we wanted to go. And the next couple of years were a bit of a technological grind to get there. And that starts in the early days here in 2012, where the three co-founders were engineers and physicists by training and also at heart. And so fundamentally, the early work was in prototyping and doing proof of concepts. So that started with building a functional device that sort of implemented these ideas that we had, how to overcome those technical challenges. And over time, maturing that, so form factor down, making it more stable, honing in the actual size and use to make it closer and closer to this kind of pulse oximeter model that we were looking for. And so not to condense 2 years of work into a couple images, but that was the fundamental technology work. But at the same time, the three of us were also working on honing in on the business model as well. So we knew that we wanted to look at PAD. We knew there were challenges there. But it's a situation where you don't know what you don't know. And we wanted to leverage the expertise and the input of a lot of the clinicians that we had in our network. Now, again, we were all at UCI. And so we essentially didn't know any better other than to go out there, and we cold called every vascular surgeon, interventional radiologist, and interventional cardiologist that we could find in the UCI directory to show them our device, show them the working prototype, ask them what they thought, ask them how it fit into the workflow of what they were doing, ask them where they thought the most clinical benefit would be by utilizing it in different portions of that patient care pathway, so diagnosis or treatment or follow-up care, and to try and hone in on where exactly we thought this technology would be the most valuable for patients with PAD. And in doing so, we were also engaged in a number of clinical studies that were really stemmed from the fact that being able to interact with academic researchers, it became relatively simple for us to tag on to non-significant risk studies and actually start taking meaningful data. And then third, we also started doing a deep dive into the intellectual property. So we educated ourselves basically starting at zero in terms of patent law, writing patents, claim language, freedom to operate. And we tried to explore what was out there in terms of the IP landscape and where we could fit into that. And so by the end of around 2015, I went back, and I think we had cold called at least 50 plus clinicians just from UCI or surrounding. We had gone and done in-person interviews with 20 specialists in interventional cardiology, radiology, and vascular surgery. We were able to collect data from more than 75 patients, and we had filed a relatively broad utility patent covering some of the fundamental methods we used for our prototype device. And so what I wanted to do with this journey is to sort of tell you the lessons learned that I had along the way. So at this stage, we were in early development, and I think looking back upon this particular stage, in terms of what I feel like I know now that I may not have known then, was that my professional network, and most likely all of your professional networks, be they personal, be they academic, they are hugely beneficial. We were able to leverage the expertise and just hours and hours of valuable expert opinion just by calling and asking and saying, hey, we're UCI alum, we're UCI students as we were in the early days. Would you be able to meet with us and just give us your opinion? I'm on the other side of the kind of the corporate spectrum now, and where I sit now, we'd be paying tens of thousands of dollars to get that information. In these early days, we got tons of it for free. And I think the other thing looking back that was hugely beneficial was going and understanding the IP landscape early on was critically important. It's not always the most exciting endeavor to go and do patent searches or do a freedom to operate, but fundamentally, if you can't protect and you can't actually utilize your intellectual property moving forward, then you're going to be spending a lot of time and money for something that's not going to pay off down the road. And so it certainly behooves you to think about those things early and to not skimp on them, both in terms of time and in money. So with that, we were feeling, I think, pretty confident in some of the input that we got. We felt like we had a pretty good business model put together. The feedback from clinicians we had was looking pretty good. But I had mentioned that we were physicists and engineers by training and in heart. And one of the blessings and the curses of engineers is that it can always be better. Nothing is ever done. And I think if we would have kept on churning, we probably could have worked more and more until we really tried to go out and do something meaningful in terms of fundraising, because up until this point, we were just spending money out of our own pockets. And it was actually a single event that kind of triggered us to try and put this into a different gear. And so this happened when we were at a podiatry office, and we were sitting in the waiting room waiting to meet with a podiatrist colleague of ours. And as we sat there with our prototype, clumsily held in our hands, there was a gentleman sitting next to us who was telling us a story that I'm trying to show here, who said that he came in to see his doctor. His doctor told him that everything was fine and that he looked good. And a month later, he had lost his toe. And this is a common story. PAD, again, leading cause of lower limb amputation. And we heard this story, and it was fairly remarkable. And he asked what we were doing and what that thing we were holding does. And on the spot, he said, wow, that would be so great for me to have at home. I couldn't fathom the value of being able to actually know what my doctor knows myself and actually see my changes in blood flow and be knowledgeable about them. And he literally offered to buy it off of us. I mean, this is like a prototype we have in our lap. And of course we declined, but it was really something that hit our hearts pretty hard, because it really highlighted the fact that this was an important use case. There were people out there who were being meaningfully, tangibly affected by the disease. And it drove home this point that what we were doing mattered and there was value there. And so it was not that much longer that we said, all right, well, it's time. We got to go out and we got to do some equity-based financing. And we went on to do our first pitch to angel investors to try and get some seed funding for the company, so that we could bring this to a next level of maturity, because all of us were moonlighting at this point and we wanted to make this our full-time gig. And so we put together a pitch where we thought that it was going to be really impactful, where we were going to tell the story of, we have this great platform technology and we're going to meet all the needs in peripheral artery disease. So specifically, there's problems with the diagnosis of PAD. The standard of care, it takes too long. It has low sensitivity and specificity. It can't be used on millions of patients. We miss all these diagnoses. We're going to have a technology to improve that. And in surgery, I already talked about this application. We're using a tool, angiography or x-rays, which doesn't allow the clinician to really quantitatively understand what they're doing and if it's effective. We're going to reduce readmissions. We're going to have a technology for that. And then in follow-up care, all the patients that undergo surgery, they're going to return to their vascular clinics to be seen, and some of them need to be seen, some of them don't. We're wasting Medicare dollars. We're gonna cut down on relapse, and so we're gonna have a technology for that. And we were, I think, very well intentioned with this pitch, and it went horribly. We certainly didn't get the money, but I think we got a lot of criticism as well. And the criticism really stemmed from the fact that we were trying to pitch a vision which was too broad and it lacked focus, and it didn't highlight the value, I think, of the technology. So the lesson learned here was really know your audience. We were biased in that we came from an engineering background, physics background, and we thought everyone would want to know about the technology side of how we were going to make these different widgets to meet these use cases. And we received exactly 0 questions about the technology. No one asked how it worked, and no one asked if it worked. It was all business model, as it should have been. And in addition to that, we tried to, again, pitch this use case which spanned the whole patient care continuum. And in doing so, it was too scattered. And so it was unclear how we were going to have a meaningful impact up front. And so we didn't really emphasize what was unique and what was disruptive about our technology. And part of the reason for that is I don't think we had a clear understanding of that until we had an opportunity to have someone who had more experience in the space kind of open our eyes to something that we had seen but not appreciated. And that opportunity came in around 2016 when we met with a key opinion leader named Dr. Mahmoud Razavi, who's an interventional radiologist. And he was greatly influential in the field. He worked with a number of big strategic partners in our space. And so he was connected to all these corporations. And it was a complete long shot that we would ever be able to get Dr. Razavi interested in our technology. But nonetheless, we just cold called him and said, this is what we're working on. This is why we think it's important. Will you meet with us? And lo and behold, he emailed us back and he said, I'm free between this time. Show up at my hospital in the waiting room. Show me what you got. And we did. We put on our suit and ties and we walked to the hospital and we brought our demo with us. And the first thing he said was basically, you guys have 15 minutes. Show me what you got because I have to go. And so we sat down and we showed him the technology. We talked about why we think it's important. And he was the one that really opened our eyes to the fact that when he put it on and he tried it, he saw that our device was real time, meaning that when you put it on, you can see your heart beating. You can see these instantaneous changes in your flow. And from our perspective, the co-founders, Of course it was. This is what the technology was built to do. And all laser speckle technology essentially can be that quick and responsive. But he had never seen anything like that before. And the minute that he saw that, he said, this is going to be so impactful for interprocedural monitoring, meaning use this specifically just for monitoring flow during surgery. Forget diagnosis, forget these other monitoring applications. There's nothing like this interprocedurally right now. There's nothing to fight against. This is where you want to be. This is where you should focus. And so it's not that we hadn't seen that, but it was that bringing in someone who knew the space very well, better than us, and you could look at our technology with a different set of eyes, really moved the needle for us. So long story short, he was extremely beneficial. And so we negotiated hard to bring him on as our CMO. And it was hugely beneficial for us moving forward. And so I feel like the lesson learned here were kind of twofold. One is I feel like we had more impact by doing this demo and having a one-on-one conversation than we had with any subsequent pitch later on in our life. Being able to have that connection was hugely impactful. And in addition to that, being able to engage with a KOL who was really well connected, both with the needs of the space, but also with the strategics in that space, is critically important. And I think that tie into the strategics is something we're going to touch on a little bit later as it comes full circle. But I think we were able to hone in on the messaging more. The technology stayed the same, but really the business model shifted and refined. And it was with that model that we were able to actually achieve the seed financing round for LAS in 2017. So the three co-founders were able to work on LAS full time, essentially quit our jobs and do this as our full gig. And we set out this milestone of reaching or getting 510K clearance on our device in less than 2 years. And so it's hard to bake a few years of work into a slide, but I'm going to do exactly that. And we took that timeline and essentially took that money, and we reached out, and the first thing we did was engage a team of advisors and consultants who really knew the space very well. Specifically, we needed resources in regulatory and quality, which we got. And we found people who had worked in the vascular space who could serve as business development advisors. And we leveraged their advice and their guidance when we needed it. We also built out a quality management system, or QMS, basically from scratch. And Linda is very well aware of those efforts. We started and worked on and completed the complete design V&V for our first product. We started, wrote, completed our complete clinical study, which was validating the technology. And we submitted our 510K application all within this time. And so there's a lot of learnings that came with all of this work. Ultimately, what it came down to was there was no magic. It was a slog. It was a lot of work. We chose not to bring on any additional employees. We just worked with the three co-founders this whole time until later on when we did indeed bring on a fourth. But we learned everything from scratch, and it wasn't necessarily hard or complicated. It just required doing the work, frankly. But the lessons learned, I would say, looking back on this in hindsight, is if you're in a regulated space, build out your quality management system early and make it lean, because if you don't, you're going to be paying for that later on in life. You're going to be working on documentation, and you're going to be confusing all of your cross-reference documentation moving forward. Linda knows. And in addition to that, we were able to begin and complete our clinical study in a relatively short amount of time. And we were able to do that because we didn't have the big onerous burden of a large corporation. We don't have a statistics department. We don't have a clinical department and regulatory department, all which chime in our clinical study. And you lose an appreciation for that when you're small, that to go out there and actually get all of that data, that very valuable clinical data when you're small, it may not feel like it, but it's a lot easier and it's super impactful. So if you're able to, and looking back on that, do it, because it helps enormously. So I want to go back to some of the things we were able to accomplish and basically highlight the two, because a lot of it was work, but the only things that people really cared about were the fact that we completed the clinical study and submitted our 510(k) application. And I'm going to bring this full circle back to that KOL that I mentioned we brought in as our CMO, Dr. Razavi, because he was then the channel through which we could articulate what we were doing, our progress, as well as sort of the clinical study endpoints and progress that we had made. And he was able to take that information, and because he was tied into all these different strategics, so Boston Scientific and Medtronic and Abbott and CSI, all these players in our space, because he's a KOL, he's tied into scientific advisory board for these various companies. He's aware of what their general strategies are, and he can get someone interested in what you're working on as not necessarily completely unbiased, but at least with a degree of objectivity. It's not coming directly from you, the company, and saying, hey, look at what I'm doing, pay attention. It has a bit more impact and a lot more of a hook if someone who has a bit more objectivity and who has the clout of a KOL is able to bring that story. And that's exactly what happened for us, and that he was able to link us up with some of the interested parties at Medtronic. And that began a long conversation and relationship that we had with Medtronic in both a partnership for development and obviously also finally in acquisition. But at this point, the story for us was that as that relationship was being fostered with Medtronic, we had received 510(k) clearance shortly thereafter. And so this is a bit of a story of recalibrating expectations, because in 2019, we received that 510(k) clearance. And I think as we had built our business model for LIS, we kind of saw this as an endpoint of saying that, you're building value in your company, and part of that is certainly clinical value, part of it is regulatory value. But here we had a strong body of clinical evidence, we had a cleared device, and we had this vision that this is potentially what's going to get us into a good position to negotiate an acquisition with a larger strategic. And that was very untrue in many ways. So the interest was real, but the timeline was very much not. So I'll play this out in terms of from the time that we got clearance, how the relationship with Medtronic sort of fostered and matured in a way that very much varied from, I think, where we had originally anticipated that it might. So it didn't turn into this negotiation for acquiring the company. What it turned into was an evolving relationship and an effort to burn down risk, and for your strategic to better understand you and how your technology can be validated. And so what that meant for us, practically speaking, was we had formed a joint steering committee with Medtronic, meaning that both us and Medtronic sat on our board in some capacity and had oversight onto the ongoings of what the company were going to be, and also just the general strategy of what we were doing. LES maintains control, but just general awareness of where things were going was the idea of having a joint steering committee. And in addition to that, for the cooperation and future development work, we also negotiated a second financing round with Medtronic to facilitate some future risk burn down efforts. And so what exactly does that mean? For us, we had cleared the device that I referred to, the FlowMet, but that was not enough to validate that the marketplace was real. And so we ended up engaging in a distribution agreement with Medtronic as well, wherein we would manufacture the device, we would give it to Medtronic to distribute, And they would go out and they would validate that the marketplace was there, that the customers were real, that people would see the value, and more importantly, that they would buy the technology. And then in addition to that, we had clinical data, but nonetheless, we also engaged in an independent Medtronic-led clinical study. So basically, we supplied devices. Medtronic performed the clinical study to basically demonstrate to themselves that all of the endpoints, all of the results and conclusions that we had showed them, they were real in their hands too, that they could recreate them. And so that second financing round was really to drive these two efforts, and then also drive this one, which was also critical, in that there was an additional clearance milestone tied to our relationship, meaning that to further our agreement and our relationship with Medtronic, that we would work towards building and clearing yet another device. And so it was similar, but we had to get 510K clearance on the next generation of the FlowMet, which instead of using a reusable probe, utilized a single-use disposable sensor, because this fit with Medtronic's business model of recurring revenue. And as we chewed through all of those tasks, we also worked through a bunch of tangentials as well, which were multiple in-person audits by Medtronic, looking at our quality system, 2 significant rounds of due diligence with them, as well as inspections by the California FDB, the Food and Drug Board. So all of this to say, and just to show that it wasn't just about getting to the point that we thought we would be attractive to a potential acquirer. It was about understanding the needs to burn down risk from our strategic, and how we would need to transform what we were doing to fit their particular business model. And so fundamentally, to boil this all down, the lessons learned, I think, in a lot of that condensed work that happened over the course of a year, was to understand that these large strategic, these big companies, that if you have a startup company you might be interested in exiting to, they're going to naturally be risk averse. I mean, this is particularly true in the medical device space, and probably less so for other spaces. But understanding that burning down that risk and finding ways to mitigate those risks is going to be critically important to them. They're not going to buy the hope and the dream, right? It needs to be real, validated, and verified, and quantitative to be attractive. And I think that plugs into this secondary point of why is that so necessary? And this seems simple, but I think it's worth articulating that everyone is selling to their boss. So no matter who you're talking to, someone needs to justify a deal being done. And most likely that person is going to the person above them to go to bat for you, for what your acquisition is going to be, whether it kicks off, the price, whatever that interaction is going to be. Someone needs to go in and they need to sell that. And so you need to equip that person with what they need to tell that story. And so, there's a lot of interaction and hope that happens in these negotiations, where you want to play it really hard and be a tough negotiator. And there's certainly a time and a place for that. But at the same time, I think it behooves everyone to understand that everyone's human. Everyone has to go in, and they're trying to make an internal pitch to whoever's above them to make the deal happen. And I think it's very helpful to keep that in mind and to equip those people with what they need to make a compelling argument, so they feel like they're in a good place to push the deal, the acquisition, whatever it is, forward. And I think that kind of plugs into the third bullet point, which is fundamentally, I feel like the deal with Medtronic for us was built on the technology, and that the whole reason we had the conversation is because I think we had something unique. But the deal was closed on relationships. Again, we found people who were aligned with thinking this technology was beneficial, thinking interprocedural monitoring was really going to have a big impact. And you need those people, you need those champions to help push things through on the strategic side. And those sort of relationships and fostering them is really important, I think, to making it happen. And then last bullet point, is just my personal experience in that I actually found all the negotiations that we had, both with Medtronic, but also with other parties too, to benefit from transparency and honesty. I think that in the world of corporate negotiation, a lot of people err on the side of trying to play their cards close to their vest. And I'm not saying there's not a time and a place for that, but I think that when you try and be open and upfront, it tends to be disarming for other people, and they tend to mirror that. And then, the counterpoint to that is if you're cagey and you're trying to do a bit of games playing to get to where you need to be, people are perceptive and they understand that, and they're going to reciprocate with like behavior. And so I think it's important to keep that in mind to make these negotiations move forward smoothly. So that's it. Over the 8 years of work from the 2012 to 2020, there was a whole lot of work that went on in the middle. And there's also a whole lot of learnings and mistakes and hopefully some victories too that happened in the middle, which I couldn't talk about. But I'm happy to address any of them if we have some time for Q&A.
Sean, thank you so much. Great talk. I loved your presentation. Bravo.
Thanks, Carrie.
Well, I know Linda has a question.
Who's your favorite consultant?
Oh, that's so easy. Linda McCarthy, quality engineer, bar none. The best consultant LES ever had.
Yes, because I didn't seek your company. That was my objective. So I'm glad you made it. I'm really excited to see you. I know how hard you work. I sat in the office watching you guys. I do have one question. I sat there watching the three of you having to make decision after decision after decision. How did you know you were making the right decisions?
Oh, I think that's easy, as we didn't. It's kind of a funny situation because in some ways, I feel like myself, Bruce, and Tyler were the co-founders of the company. We were all PhD students and we all met in grad school. And I think being in a world where you work on something which is your own and doing your dissertation work, it equips you, I think, for this situation where there's no one to ask. If you're working on something new and novel, you're exploring something that's never been explored before. And so I'd like to think we're all pretty comfortable with this space where the problem was always underdefined. There's no right answer. And so I think in the world of entrepreneurialism, that comes up so often where it's not clear what the right answer is. And certainly the wrong thing to do is to make no decision at all, because you'll stagnate. And so ultimately, I think you just need to take the information you have at hand, try and make the best judgment call that you can at the time. And then if it's not, and sometimes it won't be, course correct as you can. But I think you kind of hit this rule of you get to diminishing returns of like the value and looking for more information to answer a problem. So I'm kind of a believer in like get to 90% confidence and then make the decision, because you could spend a lot of time getting to like the 99% and it's probably not going to move the needle all that much.
Now, besides your technology, what do you think is your most valuable asset when you were trying to attract potential acquirers? Outside of just your
I think far and away, there's probably multiple answers there, but clinical data was definitely the biggest needle mover for us. Getting a clearance was obviously critically important. Management system, actually having like tangible things to show were important, but nothing I think in our space is as impactful as clinical data. And there with the goal of selling a million devices, but I think certainly sales numbers and clinical data are going to be the biggest movers.
Gotcha. Now, Linda was mentioning decisions, and can you just kind of in hindsight is always 2020. Do any particular decisions were they extremely, like a couple standout ones that were extremely helpful or harmful that just, you carry with you to this day?
Yes, and there's many bad decisions that stand with me to this day.
Harmful. I like to hear that one.
Yeah. I'll start with a good one to keep it optimistic. So there was a point when I had mentioned that Medtronic was requesting to do an independent clinical trial where we basically hand over the device and they take data and they see what they get to kind of validate what we saw. And the truth was that I picked the brains of a few of our advisors for what they thought about the benefit of this was going to be and what the danger was. And I think across the board, they all recommended that we do not do it. And it was part of this idea of kind of keeping the kimono closed, and that who knows what they'll see. They could misinterpret what they see, even if it's good. And so there's not a whole lot to gain, but there's a whole lot to lose. And I think that I just fundamentally disagreed with that. And I think that if you believe in what you have and the value of it, and we did, then we had to believe that in someone else's hands they would see it too. The caveat being we made sure to put it in the hands of a clinician that we knew was going to understand and be interested in the technology. In the wrong hands, I think it could have gone very much the opposite way. So it was certainly a risk, but I think it was like a smart risk in that it was an informed risk. So I think I'm glad we made that decision because that ultimately ended up being really impactful towards building this relationship with Medtronic. One of the decisions I wish that I would have made in hindsight that I didn't was we built all of our intellectual property into one company, and then being engineers, you end up having other ideas that are related but somewhat tangential to what we did in the beginning. And we chose to wrap all of those ideas into one company and then try and say, look at all the value we have. Because we did everything that I talked about today, but there were some other applications we were looking at where we thought blood flow could be valuable. And we wanted to, upon negotiating acquisition through different parties, to peel that off and to segment that piece of intellectual property as being something separate from the initial sale. And that proved to be really difficult to do. And what I've seen other people do is build subsidiaries and place their intellectual property in various subsidiaries so that if and when something happens with one parent company, you have a very clean distinction between those. And so in hindsight, I think that I wish I would have thought more proactively about that.
Wow, that's phenomenal insight. Thank you so much. Well, I want to be respectful of your time. We have like 3 or 4 minutes left. Any closing remarks before we wrap up for the day? Any inspiration for our startups in the community? I see Ray on, founder of Vena Vitals, who's one of our ULP residents. Hi, Ray. Any last thoughts for our little startups swimming upstream?
Well, I can definitely throw some final thoughts in there, which are I guess just my own experience, which is I'd love to believe that we were a really special group of people with a fantastic work ethic and great smart ideas, but I think that fundamentally the way we got from A to B was really just putting our nose to the grindstone and doing the work. And obviously the idea had to be, had to have legs and had to be valuable. But I think that the hard work was really what drove us. And I think we were all really passionate about what we had to do. And we always knew between the 3 co-founders that no one was going to give up. We were all in this 100%. And I think we carried each other from the beginning to the end. And I don't think that's necessarily unique. I think that's a trait which is really shared upon entrepreneurs because it's just what it takes. And so I think that's probably a spark that everyone has. So hopefully that's a motivational saying.